Good evening. Day 2, the Black History Month, Lynching in America, the Equal Justice Initiative, Secession and Emancipation, Chapter 1, Progressive Reconstruction. This is Pure History, the Black History Month celebration and saluting the work of the Equal Justice Initiative in their work to uncover the terror and violence that our ancestors faced being black in America. The Memphis and New Orleans attacks, which occurred just before the midterm elections of 1866, sparked national outrage outside the South and mobilized voters to support the Republican Party's progressive platform, advocating expansive rights and protections for African Americans. Republicans won a landslide victory in the 1866 congressional races, gaining a veto-proof majority and control of the legislative agenda. Senator Charles Sumner of Massachusetts and Representative Thaddeus Stevens of Pennsylvania then led the Progressive Caucus in devising an ambitious civil rights program broader than anything Congress would attempt for another century. First, Congress passed the Civil Rights Act of 1866, which declared black Americans full citizens entitled to equal civil rights. I thought that's what happened when they banished slavery, that they would be full citizens and attain equal civil rights. I guess not. They needed an amendment for that. President Johnson vetoed the bill, but Congress, for the first time in the United States history, overrode the veto. Next, the Progressive Republican supermajority quickly passed the 14th Amendment, intended to eliminate any doubt about the constitutionality of civil rights. The proposed amendment established that all persons born in this country, regardless of race, were full citizens of the United States and the states in which they resided, entitled to the privileges and immunities of citizenship, due process, and equal protection of the law. If ratified, the amendment would supersede the United States Supreme Court's 1857 decision in Dred Scott versus Stanford, which held that African Americans were not citizens and had no standing of which a white man had to honor, had no right to sue in federal courts or stand on trials or vote. They were simply not even considered human. 28 of the 37 states had to ratify the 14th Amendment in order for it to be added to the Constitution, but when Southern legislatures first considered the amendment, 10 of the 11 former Confederate states rejected it overwhelmingly. Louisiana unanimously. In response, again over President Johnson's veto, Congress passed the Reconstruction Act of 1867, which imposed military rule on the South and required that any state seeking readmission to the Union had to first ratify the 14th Amendment. In July of 1868, the 14th Amendment was officially adopted. The Reconstruction Act of 1867 also granted voting rights to African American men while disenfranchising former Confederates, dramatically altering the political landscape of the South and ushering in a period of progress. In elections for new state governments, black voter turnout neared 90% in many jurisdictions, and black voters, who comprise a majority in many districts and a statewide majority in Louisiana, elected both white and black leaders to represent them. More than 600 African Americans, most of them formerly enslaved, were elected as state legislators during this period. Another 18 African Americans rose to serve in state executive positions, including Lieutenant Governor, Secretary of State, Secretary of Education, and State Treasurer. in Louisiana in 1872, P.B.S. Pinchback became the first black governor in America and would be the last until 1990. The Reconstruction State since 16, and of course 1990 is when Douglas Wilder was elected governor of Virginia, the bedrock of the Confederacy. The Reconstruction State sent 16 black representatives to the United States Congress. In Mississippi, voters elected the nation's first black senators, Herm Revels and Blanche Bruce. The newly elected and racially integrated Reconstruction governments took bold action at the state level, repealing discriminatory laws, rewriting apprenticeship and vagrancy statutes, outlawing corporal punishment, and sharply reducing the number of capital offenses. African Americans also won election to law enforcement positions like sheriff and chief of police and were empowered to serve on juries. Despite their advances, the racially diverse Reconstruction governments faced significant challenge. For one, the issue of social equality continued to divide the Republican Party. Black members and progressive whites advocated the full eradication of white supremacy, while more conservative whites still supported some forms of racial hierarchy and separation. Because nearly all black voters supported the Republican ticket in every election, sort of like the Democratic ticket today, the party began to take Freeman's votes for granted and shifted its attention towards courting more moderate white swing voters. In addition, the Reconstruction governments faced a crisis of legitimacy as their efforts to attract capital to war-torn southern state economies raised accusations of corruption and graft. In the midst of this growing instability, officials struggled to control increasingly violent and lawless groups of white supremacists in their states, beginning as disparate social groups of the former Confederate soldiers. These groups morphed into large paramilitary organizations that drew thousands of members from all sectors of white society. Collectively, and with the tacit endorsement of the broader white community, their members launched a bloody reign of terror that would overthrow black Reconstruction and sustain generations of white rule. White backlash, the Ku Klux Klan in the Reign of Terror. Racial violence aimed at reestablishing white supremacy was widespread throughout the former Confederate states following emancipation in the Civil War. In 1866, Ellie Potts, a white woman living in Paris, Texas, again Texas, the home of Juneteenth, or Juneteenth. Well, there was no Juneteenth in 1866, when she wrote a letter entreating President Andrew Johnson to do something to curb the widespread violence raining down on local black people. She wrote that whites were so angered at the idea of losing their slaves that they were trying to persecute them back into slavery, and the result was brutal violence. Black people are often run down by bloodhounds and shot because they do not do precisely as the white man says. Ain't nothing Juneteenth about that. The post-war period was a time of frequent, extreme, and often undocumented violence targeting newly emancipated black people. As historian Leon F. Lidwick writes, how many black men and women were beaten, flogged, mutilated, and murdered in the first years of emancipation will never be known. Similarly, historian Eric Farner explains, the wave of counter-revolutionary terror that swept over large parts of the South between 1868 and 1871 lacks a counterpart either in the American experience or in that of the other Western Hemisphere societies that abolished slavery in the 19th century. America's reign of terror against black people, white America's reign of terror against our black ancestors, had no counterpart in terms of analysis or comparison. There was nothing like it. Occupation by federal troops restrained this violence but did not eliminate racial attacks or the commitment to white supremacy that fueled them. The political movement to restore white dominance in the South following the Civil War was termed redemption, and its advocates, called redeemers, were staunchly opposed to progressive Republicans and black citizenship rights. This set up a tense conflict. As black people became voters with significant political power, especially in states and counties where they constituted majorities, disputed elections often devolved into bloody massacres. In the face of black political and economic competition created by emancipation and progressive Reconstruction, white-black backlash worked to reimpose white dominance through violent repression. In 1868, white Democrats, angered by growing black support for white Republican candidates in St. Landry Parish, Louisiana, terrorized the local black community in 2 weeks of attacks that left more than 100 black people dead. In 1873, after a very close gubernatorial election, a militia of white Democrats killed dozens of black Republicans in what became known as the Colfax Massacre, a massacre that we read from start to finish on the Black Man's Read Aloud Hour. Similarly, in 1875, a paramilitary group known as the Red Shirts, Ben Tillman's group, organized in Mississippi to undermine black political power by disrupting Republican rallies, intimidating black voters with threats of violence and economic reprisal, and assassinating black leaders. Colfax, Louisiana. Grant Parish in central Louisiana was one of the several new parishes or counties created during the Reconstruction. Grant Parish being named after Civil War Union General Ulysses S. Grant, and it was home to the town of Colfax, a sugar and cotton plantation during slavery. Colfax rapidly transformed into a district controlled by political progressives in the early Reconstruction era. In 1872, following several years during which white Confederates in the Democratic Party worked to undermine black elected progressive Republican officials, several Democratic candidates won an election widely recognized as fraudulent. In response, black protesters refused to recognize the illegitimate election results and staged a peaceful occupation of the town courthouse. Several weeks later, approximately 140 whites surrounded the courthouse, and in the first week of April 1873 engaged in skirmishes with black militias that resulted in several deaths. On Easter Sunday, that's right, Easter Sunday, 300 whites attacked the courthouse and 3 whites were killed in the assault. The outnumbered black forces waved white flags in surrender, but the assault continued. Numerous unarmed black men who hid in the courthouse or attempted to flee were shot and killed. Approximately 50 African Americans who survived the afternoon assault were taken prisoner and executed by the white militia later that evening. As many as 150 African Americans were killed in the massacre, described as the bloodiest single act of carnage in all of black Reconstruction. The whites exacted this violence faced no consequences because the United States Supreme Court dismissed all federal charges against them. The local narrative in Colfax has continued to praise the cause of racial violence and embrace the message of racial hatred. In 1921, the town erected a memorial to the 3 whites who died during the Colfax Massacre, memorializing them as heroes who fell fighting for white supremacy. In 1850, at the site of the old courthouse, the state erected a monument that reads, "On this site occurred the Colfax riot in which 3 white men and 150 Negroes were slain. This event on April 13, 1873, marked the end of carpetbag misrule in the South. Today, Colfax is a town of less than 2,000 people. Both markers still stand. The earliest seeds of violent white resistance to Reconstruction were planted in of Pulaski, Tennessee in late 1865 when 6 Confederate veterans formed the Ku Klux Klan, made up of well-educated young men of comparable wealth who would go on to prominent careers in law and state politics. The group was initially informal with the slated purpose of amusement. The KKK spread quickly and developed a complex hierarchy with rules as intricate as an army manual. In less than a year, chapters spread throughout Tennessee and into northern Alabama. Famed Confederate General Nathan Bedford Forrest was the Klan's first leader or Grand Wizard, and today he is immortalized in stone monuments in many towns and cities throughout the South. Far from the small band of extremist outsiders it is now, the Klan drew members from every echelon of white society in the 19th century, including planters, lawyers, merchants, and ministers. In York County, South Carolina, nearly the entire white male population joined the Klan and similar organizations, including the Knights of the White Camellia, and the Pale Faces were independent and decentralized, but shared aims and tactics to form a vast network of terrorist cells. And that's what they were, terrorists. By the 1868 presidential election, those cells were poised to act as a unified military force supporting the cause of white supremacy throughout the South. Shortly before the 1868 election, progressive Republicans looking to remove President Andrew Johnson managed to have him impeached by the House of Representatives, but failed to secure his conviction in the Senate. As a result, Johnson remained in office and the Republican Party suffered politically. As a result, former General Ulysses S. Grant, a moderate, won the Republican presidential nomination. In the general election, Grant faced former New York Governor Horatio Seymour, who campaigned as the white man's candidate. In a March 11, 1868 speech to the New York State Democratic Convention, Seymour said that black people are in form, color, and character unlike the whites, and are, in their present condition, an ignorant and degraded race. Seymour also criticized post-war congressional civil rights laws that, by prohibiting racial discrimination and establishing equal citizenship rights, abolished the black man and made him a white man by legislation. As white terror groups sought to suppress the black vote and deliver the South for Seymour, violent attacks in Alabama, Louisiana, and Georgia resulted in hundreds of deaths and successfully prevented black people from casting a single vote in many counties with significant black populations. Despite the campaign of terror, Ulysses Grant carried most of the southern states and won the presidency. The Klan initially retreated, and Grand Marshal Nathan Bedford Forrest called for its dissolution, claiming that its mission had been hijacked by rogue elements, a refrain that became common among Klan leaders seeking to distance themselves from the extreme violence that they had encouraged. While the Klan partially disbanded as a unifying political organization, a patchwork of local entities continued to seek its goal, enforcing white supremacist social mores and economic structures through bloodshed and intimidation. Varied white groups took up the cause for restoring labor discipline in the absence of slavery. Vigilantes whipped and lynched black freemen who argued with employers, left the plantation where they were contracted to work, or displayed any economic success of their own. White terror groups also focused intense energy on imposing their own vision of a righteous society, which usually meant targeting black men for perceived sexual transgressions against white women. Charges of rape, while common, were routinely fabricated and often extrapolated from minor violations of a social code, such as paying a compliment to a white woman, expressing romantic interest in a white woman, or cohabitating interracially. White mobs regularly attacked black men accused of sexual crimes, and historians estimated that at least 400 African Americans were lynched between 1868 and 1871. Whites also sought retribution for alleged rapes by targeting entire black communities with violent public and sexualized attacks, including forcing victims to strip, binding them in compromising positions, and whipping their genitals. Widespread rape of black women, sometimes in front of their families, and genital manipulation and castration Through these acts of violence, white vigilantes used terror to revive the privileges of white masculinity over the bodies of their former slaves. Wavering support, federal government indifference, and legal opposition. By 1870, state Reconstruction governments were nearly powerless to stop the counter-revolution surging within their borders. They sorely needed federal aid, and initially they got it. President Grant supported progressive Reconstruction and provided federal troops to enforce it. In addition, Congress passed a series of enforcement acts in 1870 and 1871 and the Ku Klux Klan Act of 1871. These laws authorized individuals to go to federal court to help when their civil rights were violated, and empowered the federal government to prosecute civil rights violations as crimes. In southern states, Reconstruction governments officials remained ineffective in stopping rampant white violence, undermining officials' legitimacy at home and frustrating Republicans in the North. In the 1872 election, the Republican Party split along regional lines, and New York publisher Horace Greeley challenged incumbent President Grant for the presidential nomination. Representing the liberal reform wing of the party, Greeley generally supported civil rights for freemen, but his commitment to equality was tepid. He referred to African Americans as an easy, worthless race, and supported universal amnesty and restored voting rights to former Confederates. Grant won the nomination in a second term by a landslide, but political division remained and violence in the South persisted. The rise of a new insurgent group, the White League, brought more terror, and the larger white community and legal establishment did nothing to stop it. White mobs attacked black voters. The United States Supreme Court began an assault on the legal architecture of Reconstruction. The court's intervention was orchestrated by a lawyer named John Archibald Campbell, a former Confederate bitterly opposed to Reconstruction. When Louisiana's Reconstruction legislation implemented regulations consolidating New Orleans slaughterhouses into one location outside the city, Campbell saw an opportunity to undermine the recently ratified 13th and 14th Amendment. His suit on behalf of a group of white butchers argued that the Louisiana law forbidding slaughterhouses within the city limits interfered with the butcher's livelihood in violation of the 13th Amendment's ban on slavery and the 14th Amendment's Privilege and Immunities Clause. Campbell sought to use the amendments as weapons to bring about the demise of Reconstruction. If he won the case, the courts would extend the Reconstruction Amendment's protections to the economic interests of whites, undermining their purpose. If he lost, the amendment's powers would be nearly destroyed. The Campbell case and several others were consolidated into the slaughterhouse cases and considered by the newly activist Supreme Court. Prior to 1865, the court had only twice struck down congressional acts as unconstitutional. Between 1865 and 1872, the Supreme Court did so 12 times. The slaughterhouse cases would make 13. The court's 1872 decision held that the 14th Amendment protected solely the privileges and immunities conferred by national citizenship, a narrow category of rights mostly irrelevant to the struggle facing Southern black people. The court reasoned that the rights derived from a person's state citizenship were enforceable only in the state court, a form dominated by the white ruling class and utterly hostile to claims by African Americans in the South. Though the slaughterhouse cases explicitly acknowledged that the Reconstruction Amendments were adopted to protect the rights of formerly enslaved people, the decision eviscerated their practical impact by drastically limiting the freemen's ability to enforce their rights in federal court, the only forum where they stood a chance of a fair hearing. The 14th Amendment was tested again when the United States Attorney in Louisiana brought federal criminal charges against the white perpetrators of the Colfax Massacre. Charges were brought forth under the Enforcement Act, which made it a federal crime to conspire to deprive a citizen of his constitutional rights and allowed the federal government to prosecute any crime committed as part of such a conspiracy. The statute provided that the underlying crime could be punished with the same penalty prescribed by state law and federal authorities took the unprecedented step of charging white defendants with capital offenses subject to the death penalty for murdering black people. Despite overwhelming evidence, one defendant was acquitted and the jurors failed to reach a verdict against any of the others. Before the retrial could begin, the defense questioned whether the federal court had jurisdiction to hear the case at all. For the first time, arguing that the Enforcement Act was unconstitutional as applied to private persons who were not state actors. The court reserved ruling on that issue and allowed the trial to proceed, and 3 defendants were convicted of conspiracy. The judge then ruled that the Enforcement Acts were unconstitutional, dismissed the indictments, initiating an appeal to the United Supreme Court, and the United States versus Crunch Act decided March 27, 1876. The court held that the 14th Amendment prohibits a state from depriving any person of life, liberty, or property without due process of law, but this adds nothing to the rights of one citizen against another. In other words, the courts ruled that the 14th Amendment provided protection only against actions of the state, not against the individual violence, and the power of the federal government was limited to the enforcement of this guarantee. As a result, the Enforcement Act was a dead letter. African Americans in the South were left to the mercy of white terrorists so long as the terrorists were private actors. The response was immediate. The Enforcement Act trials in most of the southern states had been halted pending the Supreme Court appeal. When Crunch Act was decided, the Justice Department, the federal Department of the Justice Department of the United States of America dropped 179 Enforcement Act persecutions in Mississippi alone. Violence continued to spread, and increasingly acts on African Americans in the South were carried out by undisguised men in broad daylight. And that is the end of chapter 1. I'll be picking up chapter 2 tomorrow, Back to Brutality, Restoring Racial Hierarchy Through Terror and Violence. Thank you.